Welcome back to another episode of Detroit Next. I'm Malachi Barrett.
I'm Stephen Henderson.
And this week we are talking to former police chief James Craig, who polls have identified as, among the top of our field of 9 mayoral candidates. He was the second longest serving police chief here in Detroit, spent most of his career out in LA. He also was the first African-American chief of a city in Maine, as well as Cincinnati, Ohio, before coming back to the city. So he's got a pretty broad range of experience in policing and public safety. And that's a lot of what we talk about in today's episode. Public safety, obviously, is a pretty big issue for this race, connected to a lot of other problems in the city.
Yeah.
I don't know. How should candidates be talking and thinking about public safety?
Well, I mean, one of the things that's true is that for the first time in a long time, we have actual good news on the public safety front in Detroit, and it's real. The low number of homicides, sort of alongside reductions in some other violent crimes, means that we finally have a strategy that is moving the needle in that direction. James Craig started his career as a police officer here in Detroit, at a time when the city was often the murder capital of America. You remember that from when I was, growing up here, and ridiculed all the time for not being able to do anything about it. Well, it doesn't look like that anymore. And there are lots of reasons for that, and there are lots of different, I think, initiatives that deserve credit for moving it. But the question for I think mayoral candidates is, how do you build on that? What would you do to make sure the momentum continues? And are there even more things you could do to reduce crime further? And then what you were mentioning, which is the way that crime connects to other issues, right? Housing, schools, services, other services. How do you move the levers so that it matters in those other places too?
One thing we talked with Craig about today is how public safety is also important for the business community and bringing business investment into Detroit.
Yeah.
And how stabilizing the downtown and improving the perception of the safety in the downtown has made a lot of CEOs and prominent business leaders feel more comfortable recruiting others to come to the city, as well as keeping their operations here in Detroit. Yeah. I'm interested how that conversation evolved. We hear a lot of complaints from residents about the heavy deployment of police resources in downtown compared to neighborhoods. We touch on that a little bit in our conversation. But the business community is interesting because they've been kind of holding out in this race so far. They don't
want to see a little more.
They don't seem to have a clear favorite yet. Somebody who's really impressed them.
I think a number of them will. Back to that question about where police resources are distributed. We need a better neighborhood police presence, and we need a better neighborhood police strategy. And the barrier to that in the last decade or more has been just the low number of officers that we have. There's not enough people to patrol the neighborhoods the way that we need to. And, all the candidates need to be talking about, well, can you change that? Is there a way to either shift resources around inside the department, shift other resources from other departments over to the police department to increase the number of officers you have? You've also got this growing part of the police department that's not just police, right? First responders now mean people who can help address mental health crises and other things in the neighborhoods. How can you build that? And that is the question that matters most to people who live here, right? I mean, downtown's great and it needs to be safe, but where we live in the city needs to be safe too. And Craig and some of the others really need to focus on, well, what is it that you're going to do in the neighborhoods, and how will you pay for it?
Yeah, how will you pay for it is always a big question.
Yeah.
Craig is running on his experience as a former police chief, having a high-level executive role with the city, and he's saying, if you like what I did when I was chief, you're going to like what I do as mayor. And a lot of our conversation kind of focuses around what he has already tried to do while having a leadership position here in the city. I'm curious how folks reflect on his legacy as chief. I think of the expansion of police surveillance tools like Greenlight,
Mhm.
which we talk about. Now we have ShotSpotter audio surveillance technology that's listening for gunfire in the city. We have cameras not only at the gas stations and liquor stores, but on highways.
Yep.
And it's a real mixed reaction to that. I think folks appreciate how it's been able to prevent, carjackings and bring down some of those crimes of opportunity. But also, it's been a problem with people being misidentified by facial
Yeah.
recognition.
Yeah.
There's a lot of concerns about privacy and the effectiveness of these tools, especially as we shell out millions of dollars for them. That's just one aspect, though, of his tenure as chief. What do you think Detroiters think about the job that he did?
Well, I mean, if you look at the polls that we have now about the mayoral race, he's doing really well, much better than most other candidates. I think the first poll had him in second. This last poll, I think he slips to third behind Solomon Kinloch.
Yeah.
So that's some indication that Detroiters don't have a negative, an instant negative reaction to him. And right now, that's all people are going on is, do you know this name and what do you think of it? So I think he's doing pretty well there. I think some things about his tenure that people might remember really will help him out. This balance between aggressive policing and community policing. James Craig actually played that fairly well. I mean, he is an old school, hard knocks kind of cop, and wanted the department to be real tough on crime and criminals. At the same time, when the Black Lives Matter protests happened, he's very proud of the record that we had here. There were people who felt like he pushed the department to be too aggressive. At the same time, we didn't have the destruction and the fires and stuff that happened in some other places that really put other residents in danger. I think he's a little bit of a cipher, though, in terms of what his leadership would mean in the mayor's office. I think that's the question he's got to answer. Police chiefs always leave Detroit with a mixed record in terms of how people think they did or how they think they were treated while that person was in charge. But we've never had someone elected to the mayor's office from that role that I can remember. Maybe if you go way back, you might have Roman Gribbs, I think, might have been the last former police officer or chief who was mayor. So he's got to answer that question. What does that mean to be mayor versus police chief, and how does that look, and what are his big ideas? Police chief is a very specific job with specific tasks. Mayor is a much broader job, and it has a lot more specific tasks, and he doesn't have a lot of experience with those things. What does he want to do if he were elected mayor?
Well, we're going to get a bit of a sense of that. I think there are some questions that remain unanswered, but definitely tune in, stay on the line with us as we transition over to our conversation with Chief Craig. All right, joining me today on Detroit Next is former police chief James Craig. Thank you so much for being here, sir.
Glad to be here.
I'm excited to talk with you. I feel like public safety has been, a really central issue in this race. Obviously, it's been a long-running issue in the city, and you have the most experience, I think, comfortable saying, in dealing with that. Let's just start, kind of high level. What's your vision for public safety in the city?
Well, as you know, you indicated 44 years in public service. I started my policing career right here in the city of Detroit when Coleman Young was mayor, and was 19 years old, served 2.5 years, and got laid off.
Mm-hmm.
And so once I got laid off, I had to make a decision. Go to the West Coast or go to Toledo, Ohio. Very difficult decision, but of course, ended up going to LA, where I served in that department for almost 3 decades, rose through the ranks. But even when I was in Detroit, I had set a goal early in my career to become a chief of police. Primarily, it was to become a Detroit police chief, but I didn't know I was going to make the sharp right turn and go to the West Coast, and I did. So I rose through the ranks. I had a great career in Los Angeles, and was a finalist in a couple of departments, Boston, Massachusetts, Tucson, Arizona, for Palm Springs. And then Portland came through first and made a job off of Portland, Maine.
Mm-hmm.
So I served there for 2 years. Very interesting city. Certainly gained a lot of experience in that city. And then from there, became a major city chief, is what it's called. I was a chief in Cincinnati, Ohio.
Mm-hmm.
And I stayed there 2.5 years. And then Michigan called because, as you know, in 2013, the city was facing bankruptcy. It did go through bankruptcy. An emergency manager was brought in, and the state was interested to know if I would be interested in coming in during that very challenging time. And of course, I've always loved a challenge, but more importantly, I got to come home. So I made a decision to do that. But I want to digress for a minute, because what was interesting, because the question I oftentimes get asked, well, when did you decide to transition from policing to politics? And, and having been a police chief in 3 cities, certainly there's a political element to that.
You were the first Black chief in Cincinnati as well as Portland, Maine,
First,
right?
in both cities, the first African-American chief. In Portland, well, actually in Maine, in the entire state.
Oh, wow.
Then Cincinnati, which is probably almost half Black, I was the first. I think I was the 13th police chief there, and the first outsider. So I didn't know what to expect going there, but what a great time. But I will tell you, one of my first meetings I had with top CEOs in the city, and for those who know Cincinnati, Procter & Gamble is headquartered there,
Mm-hmm.
American Financial, Kroger, they wanted to meet with me. And what they wanted to know is, what are you going to do to create a safe city? But more importantly, we want to really move forward and develop an area called Over the Rhine. It was a historic area in Cincinnati, but it was one of the most violent parts of the city. And so I sat there for a moment, thought about it. I said, well, I can do it. We can make it safe, and you can do development, but you're going to have to help me. And they kind of looked puzzled. I said, well, I don't want to use tax dollars to pay officers overtime.
Mm.
So that said, I'm going to need your financial help. You pay for the officers overtime, we can do it. And certainly the department got it done. I put them on foot beats around the clock. That area became safe. They ended up developing. The irony of it, cat-a-corner to that area was a casino being built by Dan Gilbert. And very successful outcome, but certainly have no regrets making a decision to come to Detroit. But that same group of businessmen approached me and said, Chief, you don't need to go back home to Detroit. It's going through bankruptcy. It's a mess. Stay here in Cincinnati, and we want to run you for mayor of Cincinnati. And so I was humbled by that. And I said, well, now I get to go home. And it was an easy decision.
Mm-hmm.
And so ended up serving 8 years as chief, one of the longest running chiefs, only exceeded by William Hart.
Mm-hmm.
I think he might have done 14 years. But certainly going through that moment, with the city going through bankruptcy and the challenges. Now, while there was a lot to be done in the city, there was a lot to be done in the police department. We heard the stories, 1 hour response time to 911 calls, homicide clearance rate that was at 11%, one of the lowest in the country. Certainly the morale of the men and women who served in the department was at the very bottom. Their salaries were taken. They were forced into 12-hour shifts. And then the morale of the community was at the bottom because they didn't trust the police department.
Mm-hmm.
So this was a heavy lift, but we got through it. Certainly as we talk more today, I'll go into a little more detail. But it's a natural progression for me. As you know, when I retired and left office after 8 years, I was pulled vigorously to consider a run for governor. I did do that. I have no regrets. In fact, throughout that campaign, I was a leading candidate on a GOP ticket,
Mm-hmm.
double-digit lead. And certainly the fraudsters got in and got some bad signatures. So several of us got taken off the ballot.
Right.
And so I had to kind of wait and see what next steps would be. And here I am today. A lot of people asked me while I was a chief, said, why don't you run for mayor? And I said, well, I don't run against my boss. I thought that Mayor Duggan and I had a great relationship, did great work together. And he was my boss. So no, I wasn't going to run against him.
Mm-hmm.
He was a 3-term mayor, but once he decided, I'm not going to run, I'm going to run for governor, then it was an easy decision.
You've talked about wanting to bring accountability back to, various aspects. You talked about it in terms of the schools, which I want to talk about.
Oh, absolutely.
But, going back to your time as police chief, it seemed like that was one of the things that you wanted to do in bringing in new administrators and kind of creating some more accountability there. What do you think is really lacking in terms of, accountability for our city officials?
I'm happy. Well, you want me to talk about schools now, or you want me to just in terms of
We can talk
overall
about schools. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm passionate about it. Certainly, I started work as a police captain, working with a middle school because I saw some of the problems. And without going into a long, drawn-out description of what that looked like, we put a boot camp in a middle school. Certainly, that school was located in a high-crime gang area of Los Angeles. Clearly, the young people were experiencing behavioral issues. And so I went to the administrator. I said, look, I have an idea. Trust me to come in here as an after-school program. Give me your most challenging students, and we can turn them. 10-week program. And so we did it, and we turned them. We ran another class, 10 weeks. We brought the parents in, and phenomenal success.
Mm-hmm. You talked about wanting to replicate this in the city, right?
Well, we did do it.
Okay.
I did it in Cincinnati because we saw some of the same issues in some of the more vulnerable neighborhoods of color. Certainly the public schools have some challenges, and I know how important it is to partner with the schools to get the work done. We did in Cincinnati, although they didn't like it being called boot camp. Said, Chief, that's too harsh. I said, what's harsh is the pipeline to prison. I said, we can talk about the name, but if this saves a young person, that they graduate and go on and have a productive career in some way, what's more important? So, we met in the middle, and I renamed it City Camp, Children in Trauma Intervention, because truly a lot of these young people were in trauma.
Mm-hmm.
When you think of PTSD, you think only police officers or someone who serves in the military, but really think about a young person growing up in a vulnerable neighborhood that's violent. At times, parents may have been shot in a violent encounter, friends, relatives. What impact does that have on that child? Very direct impact. So we launched it in Cincinnati, successful. Did a couple of classes there. Resistance by the school at first. The schools were like, well, if this doesn't work out, well, I'm not taking responsibility for it.
Mm-hmm.
Chief, this is yours. And I have no problem with that. And so when we came to Detroit, launched a similar program. And in fact, we ended up putting City Camp in an entire middle school here on the east side of Detroit. The outcome was good, but that's the partnership. That's the collaboration. And so as mayor, I recognize that, the mayor doesn't run the school, but public education is important. And if we don't fix that, we can talk all we want about bringing in new businesses, creating a city, the best city in the country. But if we have broken schools, let's take a step back and let's be realistic about this.
Mm-hmm.
There's a reason why some young parents with children say, well, and I've heard them say it, I moved out of Detroit because one young entrepreneur told me I moved out of Detroit because I wanted my son to get a better education. And I just wasn't confident that I could get it here in Detroit. And these are the kind of real conversations we need to have. And those who are in political positions and political leadership positions cannot ignore it. It affects the city.
Mm-hmm.
And that doesn't mean we have to be in conflict with one another. I've been very public about it. In fact, when I was running for governor, I was alarmed at what I was starting to find out, especially in communities of color. I'm talking around the state, Detroit, Flint, Benton Harbor, common theme. Middle school children or third graders cannot read.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, in Detroit, by way of example, and I'm told that stat has changed since it's been 3 years since I ran for governor. And I always ask this question, what do you think the percentage could be? And they say, well, 25, 35, 40%, still a failing grade. 8%.
Yeah. I think it's like 11 now, so it hasn't
That's
gone up by
11.
very much.
It still hasn't, that's still failing.
Yeah.
And so the reason why they set the standard that by the time a child is in the third grade, they must be able to read then guess what? If they go to the fourth grade and they can't read, what happens after that? And then with this mindset, well, let's just push them through because we don't want them to be demoralized because they haven't gone from third, fourth, and fifth. What's most important, let's educate these young people because it will impact them later. And unfortunately, some young people opt to drop out because they're not learning over time. And we all know that there's a greater likelihood when a young person drops out of school, that's the pipeline to incarceration.
Yeah.
More likely and then I saw this firsthand. So when Mayor Duggan, phenomenal job at really negotiating with Stellantis to bring an assembly plant here, the Jeep plant, which was a big deal because Detroit hadn't seen the development of a new auto plant in excess of 30 years.
Yeah, there were thousands of jobs that were promised as part of that.
3,500 Detroiters, part of his negotiation was 3,500 Detroiters would get hired. But here's what we learned. Some of those Detroiters who grew up in Detroit public schools, the plants of today, you have to take an examination. Basic exam. When I worked on an assembly line right out of high school, there was no exam. You just walk in, get a job. That's not how it is today. So what impact, because of a failed education system, does that have on our future workforce?
Yeah, we know we don't have that talent pipeline happening the way it should be because of that. Yeah.
I mean, I dealt with it in the police department. People say, hire Detroiters. Well, you know, I was a Detroiter when I got hired, and I believe in Detroiters becoming police officers. The neighborhood I grew up in, the 10th precinct on the west side of Detroit, was the same neighborhood I ended up patrolling as a police officer a few years later. So I understand the importance of someone growing up in the city. And that's not to take anything away from those who live outside the city, because I've worked with some phenomenal police officers who come from all over.
Yeah. But I've heard you say before, probably to jump ahead of your point, that it was difficult for some Detroiters to pass through the application process to become a police officer because they lacked the literacy skills or other kinds of skills they should have learned in the schools.
And that's the disappointing part. And so I know in LA, we saw the similar thing in LA, and we were starting to talk about doing this here in Detroit, where what we did for those applicants that came from those vulnerable neighborhoods in LA who wanted to be police officers, we would set up like a 3-month remediation phase to prep them for being able to pass the exam. But it's not just getting in the door. Once you get in the door and you get into the police academy, then there's the academic portion. And one of the biggest challenges for a lot of these new officers in the academy is getting through law. Now, we're not talking about law school. We're just talking about basic law. But again, it requires reading. And if you can't read, there's going to be a challenge. So when folks want to skirt the issue of public education, opt not to talk about it, I think everybody viewing this should say he's right and we need to do better.
Education and the mayor's role in education is definitely a big issue in this race that candidates are talking about. Obviously, the mayor has limited authority in, dictating what can happen in schools.
Right.
But in some of our past conversations, you've talked about how, the low percentage of students who can read at a third grade level is a pretty damning reflection of the leadership in the public school system, and that
it's a reflection on the superintendent. I always oftentimes make this comparison. As chief of police, if I was performing at an F level, if we want to argue and say, well, if children if only 8% can read in the third grade, that's a big fat F. If I'm performing at an F as a police chief, how long would I last? I'll tell you how long. It probably would have been but a couple of months. I've been gone. Look, it's no secret. Detroit has seen its share of police chiefs through the revolving door for a variety of reasons. Sometimes it's just because there's a new administration incoming. But there should be accountability because it's that important. This is not a reflection on the teachers. I think the teachers need to be supported. And certainly I want to play a role in being a great partner. And that does translate in supporting those principals and those teachers.
The next mayor is going to come in with limited resources compared to the current administration. You're not going to have access to ARPA money.
Right.
I've heard you talk about how your relationship with President Trump means you can bring federal resources to the city in a way that no one else can. Obviously, you are a Republican. This is a nonpartisan race, but you have a relationship with the current president. I just wanted you to talk a little bit more about that. When was the last time you guys have been in contact? What is your relationship like
I
right
spoke
now?
to him on not his last visit, the visit before. So yes, I have a cordial relationship with the current president. I'm absolutely convinced that as mayor, I'll be able to leverage that relationship. And this is not about me. This is about Detroit. Let's be candid. You know, Mayor Duggan had full support of President Biden. It was very helpful to his administration and to our city. And I think that we need to keep that going. Now, some of the other candidates may say, oh, well, I'm going to have a relationship with the White House. But yet, in other times, you've said some horrible things about the president. And so this is, to me, when people ask me the question, I think having that relationship is critical. But let me remind your viewers, I'm a Detroiter first. Secondly, this is a nonpartisan race. Third, you know, I was a Republican when I was your chief and deputy mayor. I was a Republican in Cincinnati. It's not a prerequisite that you be with one party or another when you're appointed as chief. I don't play politics. I play solutions. And in an insane way, I'll say this because this is so illogical. Imagine as a chief, and I say, well, we got a call, shots fired. And we ask the caller, are you Republican or Democrat? That's the decision of whether or not we're going to, it's ridiculous. And as mayor, there is no politics. There are issues. And what's interesting about the issues, I was a longtime conservative Democrat. I grew up a Democrat in this city. And one thing I learned from my late mom, who was a volunteer poll worker for many years as I was growing up, she instilled in myself and my siblings was vote. That's your right. Vote. But as important as voting, vote for the right person. Has nothing to do with party. And if you talk to Detroiters, they'll tell you, you know, as chief, I liked you. I liked the work that you did. Nothing changes. The R behind my name, again, it's a nonpartisan race.
I want to ask you about immigration enforcement as well, because that's a big thing that we are seeing the Trump administration in cities like Chicago and Los Angeles. We haven't seen really any kind of like directed ICE raids in Detroit, from my understanding. Mayor Duggan has been, he's reaffirmed that we are not a sanctuary city here, although the police department doesn't enforce immigration law. They'll cooperate with ICE if they're asked.
You just answered my question.
Well, yeah, my question really is if we see the Trump administration want to do more targeted enforcement in Detroit, would you partner with that? What would your relationship to that be?
Well, it depends on what targeted enforcement is. If you're talking about targeted enforcement to take illegal migrants who are criminals out of Detroit, absolutely. You know, this is a conversation I have often. And one of the things I will assure your viewers is, as Mayor Duggan indicated, and certainly I supported this as the police chief, that we're not the immigration police, number one. Two, we are not a sanctuary city, but we are a welcoming city. I've had good relationships in Southwest Detroit. However, if someone's a criminal, zero tolerance. Not because they're here illegally in our country, because guess what? Should we make exceptions for someone here in our country illegally who's committing a crime? But yet someone who is a U.S. citizen committed a crime, we say zero tolerance, you can't do that. Where's the fairness in that? And bringing up Chicago, another mayor I should talk briefly about, he has an approval rating of about 13%. 13% may be the lowest in the country. Why? Because he's done more for illegal migrants than he has for his vulnerable communities in South and West Chicago. There's a reason why many of these Chicagoans, mostly African American who said, we're going to turn Chicago red because this is unacceptable. But again, going back to the core issue, I would do nothing. I respect the laws of our state. We're a welcoming city. We are not a sanctuary city. But if you come into our country illegally and you're a criminal, you're going to be treated just like anyone else.
In some places, the ICE agents have been going into schools and churches and other places that have been, I guess, typically off limits for immigration enforcement. What do you think about that? Should that be allowed in Detroit?
Well, again, it's situational. I mean, no, as just a general going in without any type of reasonable suspicion that there is a person wanted for a crime, that's troubling. And, I've had conversations with the president, not on the immigration issue, but I've always been candid with him. He knows who I am. So, I mean, but if it was just a routine check, that kind of goes over. I mean, we certainly have a community here of law-abiding folks that are here in our country illegally. They need to be protected. But again, if the reasons are based and surrounding a person wanted on a crime, a serious crime, we got to do. Now, we should take the time to explain to our community what's going on. One thing I've known, this is not a big criticism, but one thing I've always found, municipal police departments tend to, because of our relationship with the community, and I know this was something that was important to me, is to make sure if we can't talk about it at the time of execution of whatever that operation might be, we owe it to our community to come back and say, this is why we did what we did. And that's what builds trust.
Detroit Next is a collaboration between the Bridge Detroit newsroom and the Detroit is Different studios here. We are trying to keep this free for everyone, which means we need your support. Please reach out to us. First of all, we have a phone line set up. We want to hear from you. We want to hear what questions you have, what reactions you have to the interviews that we've done so far. Let us know what you think, what you're hearing from others as well. You can call 313-284-6407. Leave us a voicemail. I think we're going to do a listener episode using those voicemails. Please give us your name and what neighborhood or council district you're in as well, so we get a sense of where you're at in the city. If you like what we're doing and you want to support us, head to bridgedetroit.com/donate and help us keep this free. You can also subscribe to our free newsletters, which come out a couple times a week. I do the city council notebook, which recaps what's been going on at your local government. You can also head to Bridge Detroit's YouTube channel to get our full episodes as well as bonus content. We are also releasing the full unedited interviews with all of the candidates as well, for those of you who are looking for a deep dive. You can find the audio version of this podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, Amazon Music, and DetroitNext.podbean.com. We are going to keep doing this all year long. We're about halfway through the field of candidates, so we got a few more folks to talk with, and then we want to bring in some residents and community leaders as well. But definitely stick with us and check out bridgedetroit.com for other coverage of the races this year.
And we'll get into city council as well. And if people have questions, now that we have the list of candidates for all of these races, if you got questions about your district, about the candidates in your district or the at-large candidates, call the number, send us an email. We'll ask those questions too.
Detroit Next is a community-led project from Bridge Detroit and Detroit is Different, which means that we can't do this work without you. We need your support. If you have a question or a comment and want to participate in this process throughout the year, give us a call. We have a phone line set up at 313-284-6407. Leave us a message and we'll play it on the podcast. If you like what we're doing, head to bridgedetroit.com and subscribe to our newsletters. All of that content, again, is free, no paywalls for anybody. We're trying to make this as accessible as possible. Head to our YouTube channel to get full episodes and interviews along with extra content throughout the year. You can also find the audio version of this podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, Amazon Music, and DetroitNext.podbean.com. We're going to be doing this all year long, so stay with us. Follow Bridge Detroit and Detroit is Different on your favorite social media platforms and take this ride with us. Thanks.